Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're venturing into something quite specific, visual snow syndrome, or VSS.
Right.
It's a neurological condition. And the name kind of hints at it, but imagine seeing the world like constantly through a layer of static.
Yeah, like an old analog TV that's lost its signal. That's the common comparison.
Exactly. And it's this persistent reality for people with VSS. We hear it might be surprisingly common, maybe in milder forms, but for those with the full syndrome, it can feel incredibly isolating.
Absolutely. And that isolation, often feeling dismissed or misunderstood, that's a big part of it.
So our mission in this deep dive is to really unpack visual snow syndrome. We've looked at research, particularly from Monash University, some medical websites, news articles too.
Yeah, trying to get a full picture. We want to explore the symptoms. There are quite a few, the potential causes, why it's so hard to diagnose sometimes, what research is happening now.
And crucially, what it's actually like for people living with it day to day.
Precisely. Because while maybe lots of us notice fleeting visual noise now and then,
Right, like floaters or a brief shimmer.
yeah, for someone with VSS, it's relentless. It's 24/7. That's a whole different experience.
Okay, let's dive right in then. The core thing, visual snow itself. What exactly are we talking about here?
Okay, so fundamentally, visual snow is seeing these tiny uh, flickering or swirling dots everywhere you look across the entire visual
It's
field,
constantly moving.
constantly moving, like static or maybe dense rain sometimes. And these dots, they can be black and white, or sometimes people see them in color or even transparent.
Wow. And it doesn't matter if the lights are on or off.
Doesn't matter. That's a key diagnostic point, actually. It's there in bright light, dim light, and even when you close your eyes.
Even with eyes closed, that sounds inescapable.
It really is. And it's not usually temporary. Our sources say the onset can be, well, anytime, really. Sometimes as early as 10 years old, sometimes not until after 40.
And once it starts, it tends to stick around.
Generally, yes. It seems to be a lifelong condition for most people who develop it.
Okay, so that's the snow part. But you mentioned there's often more to it. It's rarely just the static.
Very rarely just the static. It's often part of a wider cluster of symptoms. One common one is palinopsia.
Palinopsia. Okay, what's that?
It's basically seeing after images.
Yeah.
An image of something persists even after you've looked away or the object has moved.
Oh, right. Like if you look at a bright light and then look away.
Yeah.
But more persistent.
Kind of like that, but it can happen with normal objects too. And it comes in two main forms, apparently. Stationary after images, where the image just hangs there,
Okay.
which seems quite common, maybe around 86% according to one source. And then there are moving after images, like trails following a moving object. That's also common, maybe 60%.
So the visual world kind of echoes or leaves trails behind. That sounds disorienting.
It can be.
Yeah.
And then there's the issue with light itself, photophobia.
Sensitivity to light.
Exactly. Increased sensitivity, sometimes painfully so.
Yeah.
That affects a huge proportion, around 3/4 of people with VSS.
Makes sense if your visual system is already kind of overloaded or misfiring.
Potentially, yeah. And related to light, there's also nyctalopia.
Which is difficulty seeing in low light.
Difficulty seeing in the dark, yes. And then you get entoptic phenomena.
Entoptic, meaning things generated within the eye itself.
Correct. Like seeing floaters more prominently, those little squiggly lines or dots that drift around in your vision.
Ah, okay. Most people see those occasionally, but maybe they're more noticeable or persistent with VSS.
That seems to be the case.
Or,
And the list of other visual disturbances people report is, well, quite long.
yeah, I saw mentions of things like squiggly lines appearing, flashes of light,
Glare being much worse, seeing halos or starbursts around lights.
trails, like we mentioned with palinopsia, but maybe even more general motion blur.
Could be. Also double vision sometimes, or seeing weird colors or shapes that aren't really there. It's a real spectrum.
It sounds like a fundamental disruption of how vision works, but it's not just visual, is it? That was something that stood out.
No, absolutely not. And this is really important. There are significant non-visual symptoms that often go hand in hand with VSS.
Like tinnitus, ringing in the ears.
Yes, tinnitus is very common,
Mm-hmm.
affecting maybe 68% of people with VSS. That's a lot.
That is high. What else?
Fatigue or lethargy is reported by over half. Difficulty concentrating, sort of brain fog, around 60%.
I can imagine concentration being hard with constant visual noise.
Definitely. And then there's the mental health aspects. Anxiety is common, around 44%. Headaches are incredibly prevalent, something like 87%.
87% with headaches. Wow. That's almost everyone.
It's a huge number.
Yeah.
And it probably links into another common issue, migraines,
Ah, right. They often occur together.
very often.
Mm.
Around 59% comorbidity with migraines. We also see things like balance problems sometimes, maybe 19%, and depression also around
And
19%.
those feelings of depersonalization.
Attachment.
Yes, depersonalization and derealization. Feeling detached from yourself or from reality. That can happen too. It paints a picture of something that affects your whole sensory world, your energy, your mood.
And it's constant. We have to keep stressing that. It's often 204/7. Even when you close your eyes, the static, the other visual stuff, it might still be there. There's no off switch.
Which must make getting a diagnosis really challenging. If you have all these varied symptoms, visual and non-visual, where do you even start?
That's the crux of the diagnostic problem. Right now, it's diagnosed clinically.
Meaning, based on symptoms, not a specific test.
Exactly. It relies on the doctor taking a really careful history, listening to the patient's description of their experiences. The official criteria generally involve having that persistent visual snow for at least 3 months.
Okay, so not just a fleeting thing.
No. And critically, you also need at least 2 additional visual symptoms from that long list we talked about, like the palinopsia, photophobia, nyctalopia, diaptic phenomena, etc.
So sustained static plus other visual weirdness. But here's the kicker I read about. Standard tests usually come back normal.
That's the really frustrating part for so many people. Routine eye exams, normal. Neurological exams, even brain scans like CTs or MRIs, usually completely normal.
So you go to the doctor with these really disruptive symptoms, and they run the tests, and they say everything looks fine.
Precisely. And that's where the problems start. Doctors might not know about VSS, or they might dismiss it or misattribute the symptoms.
Attribute it to what? Migraine aura? Or maybe anxiety?
Those are common ones, yes.
Yeah.
Or depression. Or sometimes, unfortunately, patients are just told it's all in their head, which is incredibly invalidating.
It must be. There was that quote from Professor White at Monash Uni highlighting this real unmet need for understanding. That understanding it is the first step to finding treatment.
Absolutely. And he also pointed out, didn't he, that the name visual snow itself might be a bit limiting.
Yeah, because it focuses on just one symptom when there's this whole constellation of other issues.
Right. It doesn't capture the full picture of palinopsia, tinnitus, fatigue, headaches, all these other things that make it so much more than just snow.
So, if it's not the eyes and standard brain scans are clear, what do researchers think is going on? What's the potential neurological basis?
The current thinking is moving away from the eye itself and towards the brain's processing of visual information. It seems to be a network issue.
A problem with how the brain handles the signals it gets.
Sort of, yes. Disruptions in the neural networks that feed into and include the visual cortex. Monash University's Ocular Motor Lab, Professor White and Associate Professor Fielding are leading. They're doing some really key work here.
What kind of work?
They're looking closely at things like attention in people with VSS. How does their brain allocate attention, especially visually?
Interesting. And what are the main hypotheses about the mechanism?
One prominent idea is about filtering. Maybe the brain in people with VSS isn't properly filtering out irrelevant visual noise before it gets to the visual cortex.
So the cortex is getting signals it should normally ignore.
That's one possibility. Another related idea is that the visual cortex itself might be hyperexcitable or somehow generating this snow signal internally, sort of sending back noise.
Overactive, maybe. I think I read something about the lingual gyrus specifically.
Yes, the lingual gyrus, which is part of the visual cortex involved in processing complex visual details like letters. There's evidence suggesting it might be hyperactive in VSS.
Could that explain some of the more complex visual stuff beyond just dots?
It's definitely suggestive, isn't it? It points towards hyperactivity potentially being linked to the broader symptoms. And researchers are also looking at the connections between brain regions.
Like the thalamus, the brain's relay station.
Exactly. Thalamocortical connections, the pathways between the thalamus and the cortex.
Yeah.
If there are abnormalities there, it could disrupt how sensory information, including vision, is processed and integrated.
So it's not just one spot in the brain, but maybe the communication lines are faulty, a wider network disorder?
That seems to be the direction the research is heading, affecting not just pure vision, but maybe sensory processing more broadly, and even attention.
It sounds incredibly complex. Professor White made that point about how much of our brain power is actually dedicated to vision.
Yeah, a huge proportion of neurons and networks. So if that system has a glitch, it's understandable it could cause such varied and persistent symptoms.
Which brings us to the big question. Can anything be done? What about treatments?
That's the difficult part right now. Our sources are pretty clear. There's no definitive cure for VSS at the moment.
So treatment is mostly about managing symptoms.
Primarily, yes, trying to alleviate the different aspects of the condition. Pharmacological approaches have been tried, of course.
What kind of drugs?
Things like lamotrigine, which is an anticonvulsant.
Okay.
The thinking might be about reducing that possible neural hyperexcitability.
Okay. Any others?
Acetazolamide, propranolol, various things have been explored. But the key thing is their effectiveness is really inconsistent.
Meaning they work for some people but not others.
Exactly. Some people find some relief, others find no benefit, and some even report their symptoms getting worse.
That's tough. It suggests maybe VSS isn't just one single thing, perhaps different underlying causes?
That's certainly a possibility researchers are considering. It makes finding a one-size-fits-all treatment very challenging. It's more trial and error.
What about non-drug approaches? Did the sources mention anything like special glasses?
Yes, visual aids like tinted lenses, specifically FL41 lenses, which filter certain wavelengths of light, seem to help some people. They might reduce photophobia or just make the visual environment feel a bit calmer.
Worth trying for some, perhaps?
Could be. And then there are newer, more experimental things being looked at. Neuromodulation techniques.
Like TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation.
DMS, yeah, and also neurofeedback, trying to retrain brain activity patterns. But these are still very much in the research phase for VSS.
So early days for those. Need more evidence.
Definitely need more rigorous studies to see if they're truly effective and safe long-term for VSS.
Given everything we've heard about the anxiety, the depression, the sheer frustration, psychological support must be important too.
Hugely important. Counseling, cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT. These can be vital, not to cure the VSS itself, but to help people develop coping strategies.
Learning to manage the emotional impact, the stress of living with a chronic, often invisible condition.
Precisely. And it's good that research is ongoing, like that Monash study actively recruiting people in Australia and New Zealand. Progress depends on that continued investigation.
It really does highlight the need for more funding, more research, more collaboration. So wrapping up that section, it sounds like living with VSS, it's a daily reality that can be deeply impactful.
It is. It's chronic. The symptoms are persistent, often 247, like we said. And that takes a toll. Distress, isolation.
Especially if you feel like doctors don't believe you or don't understand.
That feeling of not being validated is a huge burden, which is why support groups and patient advocacy organizations are so incredibly valuable.
Connecting with other people who actually get it.
Exactly. Sharing experiences, information, resources. Just knowing you're not alone can make a massive difference. It builds community and empowers people.
Yeah, that shared understanding seems crucial. Okay, so let's try and summarize the key takeaways from our deep dive today.
All right.
Visual snow syndrome, VSS, it's definitely a real neurological condition. It's not just in your head.
Absolutely. Characterized by that persistent visual snow, but also a whole host of other visual symptoms like palinopsia and photophobia.
And non-visual ones too, like tinnitus, fatigue, headaches, anxiety.
Right. Diagnosis is tough because standard eye tests and brain scans are usually normal, which leads to misdiagnosis or dismissal sometimes.
But research is happening. Scientists are trying to figure out the neurological basis, maybe issues with brain network filtering or activity in the visual pathways.
Yeah, focusing on understanding the why to hopefully develop effective treatments down the line. Because right now, there's no cure, just symptom management with mixed results.
And ultimately, recognizing and validating the experiences of people living with VSS is just so important.
Couldn't agree more. Increasing awareness, both in the public and the medical community, is vital. Their symptoms are real, and the impact on life quality can be significant.
So here's a final thought, maybe for you, the listener, to ponder. We're still learning so much about how our brains, particularly our visual systems, actually work.
It's incredibly complex.
So it makes you wonder what other maybe seemingly minor or weird sensory experiences that people report might actually be pointing towards deeper neurological processes, things we're only just starting to understand.
That's a great point. It really highlights the ongoing journey in neuroscience, unraveling the complexities of perception and how interconnected everything in the brain really is.
Definitely food for thought. And of course, if anything we've discussed today sounds familiar, if you suspect you might have symptoms like these,
please do seek guidance from healthcare professionals. And look for those support resources and communities that are out there.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.